thank you so much for the introduction. And Mrs. Bokova, thank you so much for being with us.
Irina.
All right.
It's the way we call each other here, right?
Excellent. So we're opening a panel on stress tests to the United Nations. And we had a quick chat before this discussion about how fundamental this crisis is for the UN. Do you see this crisis as unprecedented for the organization?
To some extent, yes. We have seen that for quite some time, the United Nations was under attack. The United Nations, I would like once again to recall what was said once, that United Nations was not created to lead us to heaven, to take us to heaven, but to save us from hell. To some extent, all these years, these decades, the United Nations did this. And we have to be positive about it. Peacekeeping missions in many parts of the world, gender equality, the agenda, any single action that we have talked about today, and we will talk, has been led by the United Nations. The Convention Against Discrimination Against Women, the Commission, Beijing, a platform of action, violence against women, Resolution 1325, Women, Peace and Security, and I can continue this list. So there was a huge advancement, but we see nowadays that there are setbacks. And this is really something that worries me, worries my colleagues from the United Nations, and that is why we decided 4 years ago to establish a platform of former high-level women that have taken positions in the United Nations, from the Assistant Secretary General and above. It was an initiative by Susanna Malcorra, the Chief of Staff of the then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Argentina, my dear friend and colleague Helen Clark, the administrator of the UNDP and former Prime Minister of the New Zealand, and myself. And we did it also with the very good cognizance and feeling that the three of us, we were candidates for the post of United Nations Secretary General. We campaigned, we fought, we competed in a very good sense, and we stayed friends, and we stayed not just friends, but committed very much to the United Nations, to multilateralism, and to the agenda of women's equality and empowerment. And that is why we created our platform, which is called the Global Women Leaders for Change and Inclusion. And we are continuing now to accompany, to make advocacy, mentoring, intergenerational dialogue, and try to promote the idea that multilateralism and gender empowerment and rights of women are very closely linked. If you attack multilateralism, undermine any United Nations, you attack actually also women's agenda.
So staying on this subject of women in leadership, so when you ran for the job of Secretary General, you said that you were convinced that that election a woman would win. And as we know, that's not what happened. So there is a chance that in 2026 a woman leads the organization. But how likely do you think it is to happen? And any chance you could run again?
I did say it. You go into a campaign with the full conviction that you are going to win. I mean, there are many women politicians here, I guess, and I'm sure that they go into political campaigns with this firm conviction. Just in between brackets, when I was running to be elected as Director-General of UNESCO, and I won it, immediately after that, I was invited by TV5, the Francophone, the French channel, and the very famous presenter. While they were making the makeup and everything, he was around me and he said, "Oh, Madam Ambassador," I was still an ambassador at that time, he said, "At what time, between what and what round of elections, because I went through 5 rounds of elections, the idea that you may win came to your mind?" "Oh," I said, "a year ago." He said, "Really?" I said, "Of course, if you don't think that you are going to win, you're just not into these elections." Well, we didn't get it. But I think we, all women candidates, because I think all were very strong women candidates in this campaign, we showed a commitment to the UN, commitment to what we believe in, the values of peace, of human rights, of development, of equality, non-discrimination. And I hope that with the next elections, a woman may be elected or will be elected. Albeit, I have to confess that the situation now is very, I would say, not very conducive to this. I see a lot of setbacks into this agenda. I think that in some places the prejudices, the stereotyping is going up. We see, unfortunately, that in many parts of the world, violence against women is increasing. Girls are not going to school. Poverty among women is increasing. FGM is on the rise. We had really achieved so much through the United Nations, and a lot of this is being lost nowadays. I believe this is another argument that we need really a woman at the helm of the United Nations, and it will be a very strong message towards the world. I don't say that there are no men that are feminists and they are defending this agenda, but this is not enough. I think it's really time that a woman be elected. But it won't happen just because we think it's time. We have to work for that, and we have to work for that very, very hard. It will be more difficult, I believe, than 2016 because of geopolitics, because of all these setbacks, but we have to be mobilized as of now. I think it's just the unfinished business. We have to do it.
And now maybe one last question for you. I would like you to put maybe your UNESCO hat on. You were very involved in the war in Syria when it came to cultural heritage, and you were talking about at the time about cultural cleansing, for example. So if we look at the situation in Ukraine, there were calls to maybe create a modern monuments man for similar situations in Ukraine to preserve art and heritage sites. So do you think such a mechanism should exist? And are you also concerned about the situation in Ukraine in that regard specifically?
Oh, I'm very concerned, naturally. You mentioned my involvement when extremists were destroying monuments in Mali, in Syria, in Iraq, and I have been in all of these places during that time. And the problem at that time was that they were done by non-state actors. Mm-hmm. These extremists were not part of a single convention or something. And now we have to invoke, and I know that UNESCO is doing this. I just maybe will repeat what UNESCO is already doing. It is that we have one of the humanitarian conventions of 1954. The Hague Convention is about protecting of culture in conflict and in war, and where it's written that you should not attack in such cases institutions of culture, of educational also vocation, and unfortunately what we get, I was looking recently at UNESCO's data, there are more than 200 monuments and sites, churches, libraries, museums, other institutions, cultural, that have been damaged. What is also important, and sometimes maybe in the public discourse we miss it, that it is not just the infrastructure, it is just the people that are working. It is about librarians, about museum collections and museologists. It is about art historians. It is about creators, artists and others that are affected also there. And I would really love to see in all the already talk that is emerging, debates. There was a conference in Berlin, there will be in Paris in December another conference on rebuilding Ukraine, that these issues are very highly also prominent there, because this is what brings the sense of identity, of belonging, of, I would say, of courage to rebuild the country after such a terrible destruction and war. And I know that there are many partners that are working, UNESCO, the International Council of Museums, and bilateral, and I think it's really critical for the future of the country, of Ukraine.
Irina, thank you so much. But you will stay with us, but joining us on stage right now are Ayat Shebi, the founder of the Nala Feminist Collection, and Alba Gavaliugov Mendez, the president and founder of the Spanish Alliance of Model United Nations. Aya, Alba, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
I am going to start with you. You were the African Union envoy on youth between 2018 and 2021. You're from Tunisia. You're a Pan-Africanist. And since the beginning of the crisis in Ukraine, we talked about it, the UN was really perceived as being unable to effectively respond to one of the most fundamental threats of maybe the century, if not the UN existence. So how do you think that the UN can address its credibility crisis at the moment?
I missed a little bit the talk, but I think I want to start by saying that as a millennial, I'm a strong believer in multilateral institutions, whether regional or international. In fact, I think we don't have a choice. It's the only solution that we require right now to get out of the mess we are in. But I also think that the United Nations has failed my generation, because a lot of millennials were born or lived through either civil wars or revolutions. And, you know, I mean, we mentioned Ukraine now, but we have UN failure in Rwanda, we have in Darfur, Sudan, in South Sudan, the revolutions that happen across the African continent, starting from my country in Tunisia, to Egypt, to Burkina Faso, to many other countries. So I think the credibility is not as much in, well, it isn't the essential task of the US to uphold peace, so it's failing at its essential task, but also I think it's about voice. Whose voice is heard in the UN? Who claims to speak on behalf of others? Who is othering others within, you know, this club of countries? And we still are in a Security Council that addressing 80% of the conflicts that are happening in Africa, while Africa has no voice. We're still in a Security Council that the power is in the hands of 5 countries, and Africa has been very clear about having at least 2 permanent seats since 2005. Imagine, this been decades. So I think it's really about, the credibility is not as much about how do you prevent or address conflicts, because you can succeed or fail at that. It really depends on the leadership. But I don't think the question is of leadership right now. It's really about voice. And I think if we really want to address it, we need the biggest bloc of the United Nations, which is Africa, to have its legitimate voice.
And just turning to Alba, so you lead the Spanish Alliance of Model United Nations, so I'm sure that you also have a lot of conversations on that subject matter, and also especially with young people. So what are youth telling you that they're thinking about the UN and would like to see change?
So I think when it comes to opinions, there's always 2 elements. There's the rational element, and then there's the emotional element. So the people I have been working with for the past 10 years, rationally speaking, I mean, they dedicate their free time, most of the free time, to the promotion of the UN mission, the UN values, the UN system. So of course they think the UN is fundamental to the world functioning and getting better, becoming better. Now, from an emotional point of view, when it comes to the feelings they have towards the UN, my view is much more bittersweet. And this is very problematic, because I'm speaking of people who are passionate about the UN, and at the same time feel a lot of resignation, a lot of alienation, and a lot of frustration when it comes to the organization. So I think that if those are the feelings of the youth that are passionate about the UN, we really do have a problem, because imagine what the rest of young people feel. So I think the UN really needs to step up its game when it comes to turning much more human and playing on the field of emotions again. The organization is very complex. It leads towards technocracy very easily, and I think they need to speak human language again. This is very important because we're speaking about 50% of the world population. Nowadays, 50% of the world population are under 30. In Africa, they represent 70%. They're a social majority. In Europe, sadly, we're becoming a social minority because we're closer, not even reaching 30%. But in both cases, we're a political minority and an economic minority, and this really needs to change. And the UN needs allies like youth to survive in terms of the survival of multilateralism. So I think they need to take into account that even those who are passionate about the UN are really struggling to have positive feelings towards the organization.
Irina, I want to go back to you.
Of course, I'm feeling very much part of this conversation. Let me say that I understand very well the frustration that both of you and what Aya said. I remember in Tunisia after the revolution, UNESCO was very much involved into the drafting of the new democratic constitution, particularly the freedom of speech, the freedom of the media, but also, I would say, overall strengthening of the human rights. And now we know that there is a lot of disappointment there. But let me just say that, and of course, the problem we all know is with the Security Council, that the Security Council is not representative of what is here in the world. Now, Antonio Guterres, the current Secretary General, I think has good ideas for the reforming. It is our common agenda that next year will be presented, and our Global Women Voices are participating in this with the policy papers on different aspects related to the feminist common agenda. I think this is very important. We should not miss this opportunity in this process for next year. And maybe there are different, of course, ideas of how to create structures which are parallel to the Security Council and strengthen the role of the General Assembly and all the others. But I believe there should be a more involvement of the civil society, NGOs in the work of the agencies and the United Nations, because at the end of the day, the Charter speaks about we, the people. It doesn't say we, the governments. Of course, it's in governmental, but at the end of the day, it's we, the people. And I think this is something very important. Now, I believe it's a little bit maybe schizophrenic because there are different levels of involvement. I come from an agency, and I think agencies, funds, programs make an incredibly important role all over the world nowadays. It's not about Security Council decision, but it's really about climate change, mitigation, adaptation. It's about gender equality, it's about education, it's about girls, it's about humanitarian action, refugees, and the others. So we should not overlook this very important part that is going on within the United Nations. And it has to be supported, it has to be strengthened, they have to be given more voice into this process. And of course, we will see other ideas about the reform and kind of create these structures which will push the agenda without formal decision of the Security Council. But at the end of the day, I think a very strong voice of the civil society and youth should really push the P5s and others to take into account these decisions. I know that frustration is there, and there are people saying, oh, UN is failing, we have to create something else. But UN has universality, huge convening power still, a lot of positive history which should be built on. And We just need it. We just have to see how to make our voices, your voices, heard more there.
Can I comment on that? I think in no way I think we should replace it, but I think we should be ambitious in our reforms. I think we are settling for like small reformist changes while we need to talk about transformation and completely shifting the system. And for me, the UN, I think about it of two things. There is the secretariat, the agencies where the work is done, and I think in that space there needs to be a lot of work on stopping tokenism around youth, especially. Should stop, treating young people with 2 minutes, a speech, come and give a 2-minute speech, or being extractive to youth for free consultation and using their knowledge and paying them, for internships and so on. So there is that aspect, even reaching quotas within the UN system of like youth. When I was in the AU, we had a quota of 35% youth in the institution. So I think of that as the UN complex, system and its offices and so on. But then there is the UN, which is the club of majority old men, deciding for the rest of us, and who, sit right now in COP27 and, claim or give all these commitments and pledges, and it becomes also kind of talking rather than doing. And I think that's what the youth are saying, that you need to move from saying what you're saying and pledging and commitment to actually funding what you're talking about, to actually implementing what you're talking about. But I think it's also the frustration comes from daring to tell young people, go and do more, go and protest for your future, go and put your life on the line. It's a survival for young people, while as a leader, you sit there and give a great speech and then you go back and you achieve nothing. And I think that's where the credibility becomes so dangerous, that you sign up into something in an institution and as a group, knowing that you will not achieve anything out of it. That is extremely dangerous. It completely breaks down the accountability of the institution. And that's why young people don't trust these leaders. I was seeing the index and the surprise that young people don't trust more women than men. Actually, young people don't trust the institutions, because they're old, they're traditional, they're patriarchal, they're misogynist, they're a long list of wrongdoing, and they want to dismantle the whole system, which the leaders right now in the institution don't get that. And they're not listening to that. They're trying to do small reforms here and there, but we need to think of transformation.
And Alba, I want to go back to you and talking about reform. That's a very complex subject at the United Nations, because it always circles back to the Security Council, and most specifically the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. What are you hoping that could be achieved?
So I think here I'm going to change the register a little bit and be slightly positive, because I think we can actually be positive, but it won't be easy. Throughout UN history, we need to accept 2 facts. We are, for better rather than for worse, not yet at a San Francisco moment. So I highly doubt that anytime soon we'll see a reform under Article 108. However, that doesn't mean all hope is lost, because throughout UN history, essential parts and mechanisms and figures within the system have been worked up and developed off charter. I'm thinking about UN peacekeeping missions. Such a fundamental part of the UN system is not on the charter. The figure of states being able to be observers is not on the charter. The possibility of P5 members abstaining in the UN Security Council, it's not in the charter. Other measures, such as the ARIA formula, which has recently been used to talk about women's rights in Iran, is not in the charter and is very useful. Liechtenstein this summer passed a very interesting proposal under Resolution 262 that now automatically summons the GA every time a veto is cast in the UN Security Council. That is not in the charter. So I think the charter is flexible enough for creative diplomats to read between the lines and see where there are legal opportunities to introduce changes. So I really think we need creativity, we need bravery, and we need expertise. But I'm sure that if those three qualities are put at the service of the UN, even though a reform is needed to increase representation, we also have this other opportunity to start reform now, reform beyond UN Charter reform, but it's still possible, and it's possible already. So I think that is a glimpse of hope for the UN to start becoming better today.
Well, I think that's a good way of wrapping up this discussion with something to look up for. So thank you so much, Alba. Aya, thank you so much.
Add one thing, because I arrived when you were talking about having a UN Secretary General as a woman, right? You were talking about female leadership. And we are in a global conference for women. I cannot not talk about the female aspect. I think it's the biggest lie that patriarchy tells us, that our institutions are not ready for women or our country. You know, we heard this in Tunisia until we had a head of government who is women, or as young female in leadership, that it's not your time yet, even within women's spaces, that, oh, wait for your time, it will come. I think, and then when Dr. Ngozi becomes the DG of WTO, the patriarchy says women are breaking or cracking the ceiling. But it's like, where is the ceiling in the first place? That's patriarchy. There was no ceiling in the first place. You know, women, I come from grandmothers who were governors, who were queens, who were warriors, who were scientists, and we had matriarchal societies. So women have always been ready to lead. And I think we need to shift this narrative that, oh, when is a woman is ready, or when is the society is ready? That is what patriarchy wants us to believe, and we need to definitely dismantle that.
Thank you so much, Aya and Irina. Thank you for the discussion and for taking place in the panel.
Thank you, Alba. Thank you, Aya.